All right, so first of all, I want to thank our speaker, Bryan Caplan, for coming to MSU Denver to speak tonight. And I really want to thank the university, the College of Business, the economics department, and especially the department chair, Alex Padilla, for arranging this event. And I really want to thank all of you for taking the time to be here this evening with us. So my name is Glenn Furton. I am an assistant professor of economics and the assistant director of the Exploring Economic Freedom project here at the department. And what this project is an academic project of the department, the economics department here at MSU Denver, which began in 2007. And its mission is to enhance the educational experience of our students by providing an academic forum for open scholarly discussions, and to educate and inform our students on issues related to economic, political, and civil liberties. We explore the causes of economic freedom and development, entrepreneurship, and all things relevant to fostering a more peaceful and prosperous society. Today, our speaker is Dr. Bryan Caplan. Bryan Caplan is a professor of economics at George Mason University and a blogger at his new blog, Bet On It, which I highly encourage you all to go read and follow. Bryan is the author of several books, including Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, Why Being a Great Parent is Less Work and More Fun Than You Think, The Myth of the Rational Voter, Why Democracies Choose Bad Policies, which was named the best political book of the year by the New York Times, The Case Against Education, Why Education System is a Waste of Time and Money, and Open Borders, The Science and Ethics of Immigration. He has published over 40 peer-reviewed journal articles, and his scholarly work has been covered in popular media outlets such as USA Today, The Wall Street Journal, and The New York Times. The full extent of his academic accomplishment is too grand to cover without sacrificing the brevity I've been obliged to keep. And his recent book, the one he'll be discussing with us this evening, is Build Baby Build, The Science and Ethics of Housing Regulation. The book explores just why it is that housing costs keep rising, especially in the country's most desirable locations, an issue that hits close to home to many of us here in the Denver metro area and across the US. Following Bryan's talk, he will be taking questions from you, the audience, and in the spirit of open discussion and free expression of ideas, and a commitment to both equal liberty and the virtues of civility, we respectfully ask you to treat the speaker and your fellow audience members with the kind of respect and courtesy that a free, civil, peaceful, and prosperous society demands, which I'm confident you will do. On a more personal note, I first saw Bryan Caplan speak in 2013 at a debate. It was either on war or immigration. He was formidable, provocative, and persuasive, so much so that I read his book on democracy, which was one of the first books on public choice that I ever read or encountered, which is now my primary field of research. So I've been following Bryan ever since, and I assure you it is not just carelessly tossing around empty cliches when I say that I'm truly honored to have him with us today. So please join me in welcoming Professor Bryan Caplan to the podium.
So thank you to everyone for coming. Here's the problem that economists have. We've got a lot of answers. We have figured out what's going on in many areas of the world, and yet we usually write up our research in academic journals that nobody reads. And so the knowledge goes there and it dies and has almost no actual effect in the real world. So one of the things that I've been doing with my work is trying to figure out ways of taking what economists know and putting it into a more appealing package so that a much larger number of people actually find out what it is that we figured out and maybe act on it. This was the idea of my last book, Open Borders, The Science and Ethics of Immigration, where I tried to take a pile of research on immigration that almost no one is ever going to read and turn it into a comic book, a graphic novel. Right, this was, at the time, seemed like a crazy idea, but I just wanted to try it. And it did become a New York Times best-selling book. So, all right, maybe I'm onto something. It was also super fun to do. I have a lot of writer's block doing other books, but when I'm doing books like this, I do not. I'm not actually the artist, but I do micromanage the artist. I do storyboards. But also, I try to maintain high intellectual standards. So if you go and look at the back of the book, you'll see 50 pages of endnotes and references trying to back up what I'm putting into comics form. But anyway, this is a book that I wanted to write to popularize a pile of work that has been done on housing regulation and what it is doing to our society. It may seem like an obscure topic, but it turns out it is one of the biggest deals in the whole world. In fact, I'll say after immigration policy, nothing is more important than housing policy. All right, this, by the way, is the cover of the draft. Right now, the artist has drawn about 100 pages. The script's all done. You're going to get to see some advanced pages. They may be changed a little bit, but these are pretty complete pages, so it gives you a pretty good idea of what is going on. All right, so let's just start with what's wrong with the housing market. Over the last 50 years, U.S. housing prices have increased much more than inflation, and especially in the most desirable areas of the country, like, right here. This is a highly desirable area of the country. This morning, I was actually speaking to the Colorado Apartment Owners Association, and they were pointing out that this is the area of the country that has had the highest growth in housing prices that is not on the coasts. So yes, the coasts are worse, but out of all non-coastal areas, you are the worst. Right? That is your dubious distinction. Right? And again, this is especially in these highly desirable areas of the country. If we had a better view, this view is okay, but the view from Alex's office is awesome. He's got the corner office of the chairman, and we can see the downtown, so you can see what it looks like. It looks great. Right now, what's going on with housing prices? So everyone here has heard of supply and demand, right? Supply and demand. All right, you can train a parrot economics. Just teach them to say supply and demand. All right, this is the obvious story. And what is it? Well, the problem with the housing market, the reason why prices are so high, is that demand is high and supply is low. All right, so that's all we have to say. We figured everything out, and now we can stop, right? And eat the pizza. All right, now, as usual, the supply and demand story is not wrong. It is true that we've got high demand and low supply, but the problem is that it is deeply misleading because it suggests the problem is natural scarcity. Makes it seem like, oh no, there just isn't any place to build anything. But then you can look out your window and say, hey, why not there? Or there. I was walking around with Alex just pointing out places that new things could be built. Like, what was that Tivoli smokestack? It's like it's one of the better smokestacks I have seen, but why couldn't it be a skyscraper? All right. Anyway, deeply misleading because it suggests the problem is natural scarcity, and there is a pile of research showing that this is not the case. The problem is not natural scarcity. Rather, what's going on is that housing prices have increased largely because regulation is artificially reducing supply. There is a pile of regulation on the books that is preventing business from building stuff that business wants to build. Stuff that would then be occupied by, say, you guys when you finish college and don't want to live with your parents anymore. Your parents really cool? Do you want to live with them forever? I mean, parents are definitely cooler than they used to be, right? But still. All right. And this is one of the early pages in the book. This is actually drawn from some famous photographs of people building the Empire State Building, which took about a year, right? You don't hear about skyscrapers being built in a year anymore. And that skyscraper is not collapsed. Do you feel scared? Anyone who here has been in the Empire State Building? Right? Yeah. Or you're like, oh my God, this thing was built 100 years ago before there was enough regulation. Maybe you feel fine. All right, so what's going on? Well, this is what's wrong with the housing market. That is my personification of oppressive housing market regulation. Yes, that is Mighty Uncle Sam. He's also, if you take a look here, he's also a kaiju, so he's also Godzilla. I just wanted to do both. So he could either be like a giant or a giant reptile, depending upon the context. But so what is the problem? The problem is indeed government regulation. So let me give you a quick tour of housing regulations. See, by the way, here you can see one of my favorite characters in the book. So that is our bureaucrat character. He keeps popping up to argue with me in the book. So these are all the things that government can do to make it hard to build stuff. Yes, zone the project out of existence. Just delay. Make the builder leave a lot of land vacant. Demand expensive changes. Deny critical services. Make them fix the neighborhood. Makes them fit society. All right. Yeah, let's see. I really like this one here. Yeah, where is that guy? Yes. Yeah, I like him. Figure it out. All right. So what are some of the main regulations that we have to cope with? First of all, height restrictions. We have the technology to build enormously tall buildings. We've had this technology for about 100 years. The Empire State Building is just about 90 now. This is old technology. This is like Model T technology. And yet, we are using it a lot less than we were doing when the technology first came around. Whenever you hear someone saying, well, there just isn't land to go and build more housing in San Francisco. Space has how many dimensions again? 3. It's got 3 dimensions. You could go and build up. So yeah, you look at that peninsula and you say there's not enough room. We could go up. It's like, isn't it all full? Not even close. If you look at any aerial photography of San Francisco, maybe 10% of it is skyscrapers. The rest is just 2- and 3-story homes that cannot be knocked down and cannot be replaced because of the law. So what's going on? It's just so hard to get permission to build a skyscraper, right? And again, it's not safety. We've known how to build safe skyscrapers for 100 years. It is just someone who refuses to sign the paper and say it's okay to do it. Something else, multifamily restrictions. In most of the United States, a large majority of residential land is exclusively available for single-family homes. Right? The US is actually fairly unique in this. In Europe, they are much more used to multifamily. They have a bunch of other housing regulations. But here it is extra hard to build an apartment, to build townhomes, to build condos. Most of the land is set aside, only single family, that's it, nothing else is legal. All right, then minimum lot size. Even after you do tell someone you can only build a single family home, normally you would then say, okay, fine, well, can I build a lot of single family homes? No, you may not. You need to go and leave a lot of land for every single home. And so where a builder with 50 acres might want to build 200 homes, in my area, they'd only be allowed to build 50. There are areas near me where there's 5-acre zoning. You cannot even see your neighbor. Every home has so much land. And yet, once you own that land, if you say, hey, can I go and build some more homes and sell them to people? Not on your life. No, that land is yours to not do anything with. That's what it's for. You can put flowers there, you can mow it, your kids can run around, you can have a swing set, but you cannot go and subdivide it and put more homes there. Something else that is seemingly a small issue, but when you look at the numbers, it's a big issue. Minimum parking requirements. Just talking to the Colorado Apartment Owners Association, what do they have to deal with? It is very normal to say anytime you do finally get permission to build an apartment, which is very hard to get, then you have to have at least 2 parking spaces for every unit, maybe 3 parking spaces for every unit. Say, well, part of the point of having an apartment is so I can walk to work. Yeah, well, tough luck. You still have to go and put in those parking spaces. Furthermore, if you don't want to spend the land on them, then you can just do an underground parking structure. Astronomically expensive to do an underground parking structure. All right, and much more. Actually, one of the biggest ones I've been finding lately is just delay. There are a lot of building plans that people know will be able to do this, we're within the law. However, the local neighborhood association is going to be able to drag out the approval process for 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. Say, well, we need to have a parking study done. That takes a whole year. And then when it's done, it's like, yeah, but you changed the plans a little bit. We need a new parking study. It's going to take another year, right? And just keep piling that kind of thing on until 5 years have passed. And maybe the builder says, I guess we don't really even want to do it. It's so hard to do this, right? One fun idea that I've toyed with, you know how at some theme parks you can pay for a skip the line pass? You pay like double for your ticket and then you don't have to wait. What if we had that for building stuff? What if you could just pay extra for your building permit and then you skip the line and you can immediately start building stuff today? It's like, all right, well, how much is this regularly? Pay double. All right, stamp everything. And now the bulldozers start moving. Right, this does not exist, but why not? All right, so here are a couple of the pages. Let's see, can you see them okay in the back? A little hard to see them in the back. All right, now this is a recurring character. This is the fat cat. This is the rich guy that makes money selling houses and therefore people hate him. But is he really a bad guy? Well, let's see, anyone here ever build an apartment complex? Yeah, normally they're built by people with money to spare, right? So it's going to be someone like that. All right, so yes. So here, developers are champing the bit to build new skyscrapers. And yeah, why do you want to build a skyscraper? Yeah, I want to make some money, right? But regulators fight them tooth and nail. So there's Uncle Sam saying, or evil Uncle Sam, you're building too tall. And then the money goes away. Developers love to erect multifamily structures. If you could either go and build 1 house or 40 apartments, what's going to give you more money? It's like that would have to be a pretty nice house to be worth as much as 40 apartment units. Have you ever gotten to an area like, is that just a house for 1 person? No, there's like 10 people live there, 10 families. Because you can make a lot more money by doing that normally. So yeah, developers love erecting multifamily structures, but regulators zone most residential land for these detached single-family homes. So yeah, so there's Uncle Sam saying you're building too tall and too dense. Now, how much does regulation raise prices? This is one of the main issues that economists have worked on. If you go back to the earliest time when we have data on housing prices, well, we can see it was very common for housing prices to go up. This would be about 130 years ago. See, housing prices go up, but then until about 50 years ago, anytime housing prices went up, they would go back down. They'd go up and they'd go back down. What was going on? Well, back in the old days, regulation was very light, and when housing prices went up, this meant that it was now profitable to build the homes. The selling price of the homes now exceeded the physical cost of producing the homes, and if you can produce a home and sell it for more than its physical cost, you make money, right? Basic economics, right? If your inputs cost less than your sale price, you have made money. So the normal system was when prices got up, people started building a whole lot of homes to take advantage of the high prices, which caused the prices to fall back down because there's greater supply, right? And this is how it went for about 80 years of data. Prices go up, they go back down, up, down, right? All the while staying very close to the physical cost of production. Until about 50 years ago, when housing prices started going up and then plateauing and then going up again and then plateauing. There were a couple of reversals, like you guys might vaguely remember the Great Recession, right? Real vaguely, probably. But anyway, you might have had some neighbors who lost their home at that time. All right, so there was a time when prices went down about 20, 25%. And then guess what? About how long did it take for them to get back to where they were? Like 4 years. And now they are actually way higher than they were at the very peak of that at the very peak of the last peak of housing. All right, so basically the normal thing that has happened historically is that housing prices keep going back to this break-even level based upon physical production costs. Right. A rough estimate based upon modern data is that housing prices are now at about double the physical production cost. All right. So how do we know this? Well, over here, there's two famous economists, Ed Glazer and Joe Giorco, who go and walk us through the evidence in the book. All right, so here's what they started doing about 20 years ago. They said, well, let's take a look at two different homes. They're very similar in every other way, except one has a bit more land. But the key thing is they are zoned to build a single detached family home, each one. So basically, on each of the extra land is there, and you can put flowers on it, you can run around on it, but you can't build anything on it. So they say, right, the physical cost of land is really just the land where you don't have permission to build. Right? It's land, it's perfectly good land, but it is illegal to build anything on it. Right? And they say, well, let's use that for the actual cost of the land, and then we'll go to standard industry manuals to find out what construction costs are, and we'll add those land costs to those construction costs, and then we'll compare that to the price. And we will say the difference between those two things. The difference between the market price and the physical production cost is what they call the zoning tax. That is all the extra cost that has been added on by all of these regulations in combination. Does that make sense? All right. Good. All right, so how much does regulation raise prices? All right, so the early zoning tax research found very large taxes in the most desirable areas, but not much elsewhere. So the early story was, well, there's huge zoning tax in the Northeast Corridor, huge zoning tax in Los Angeles, huge zoning tax in the Bay Area. The rest of the country is pretty much fine. All right, this was the early story. But later work got much better data. And they realized, well, we really need to realize that Colorado isn't just one housing market. There's different parts of Colorado. And there's some areas of Colorado where hardly anybody lives, where the effect of regulation is pretty much nothing. On the other hand, there are places where a lot of people live. And there, they discovered there's almost always a large zoning tax in city centers. Furthermore, normally that zoning tax, though it does decline as you move further away, it often stays high for 15 miles or even 30 miles from the city center. So basically, if you want to understand what the zoning tax looks like, Just imagine taking a cone and putting it on top of, say, Denver. Right? The cone is really high, indicating a really high tax in the city center. And then as you move out, it declines, but it still stays pretty high for miles and miles away. Let's see. Let's see. I don't actually have Denver in the book, right? But anyway, here we've got a picture showing that many places we think of as lightly regulated metropolises actually do have a lot of regulation that is really raising the price of housing in the places people actually want to live. If you don't want to pay the zoning tax, you could live in the middle of nowhere in Alaska. But if you want to live in Anchorage, you're probably going to be paying the zoning tax. Right? And like, well, why live in Anchorage when you could live in the middle of nowhere? Yes, well, the question kind of answers itself. All right, so even places that we think of as having very light regulation like Dallas, if you get 30 miles away, then it is light. But if you're in the city center, then you're talking about $180,000 an acre. Or if you're looking at Chicago, right? Chicago, if you get 30 miles away, homes are pretty cheap. But right in the city center, that is like 1.6 million per acre added on. All right, so basically the idea is this. If people live there in large numbers, they are greatly overpaying due to regulation. Now, what is the big deal? Why write a book about housing instead of a bunch of other things the government makes expensive? You've probably heard government makes food expensive on purpose, right? All right, but we're really very certain agricultural products. The reason why this is so important is pretty simple. People spend vastly more on housing than they spend on, say, gasoline, which they complain about a lot more. You've probably been hearing people complaining about the high price of gas, or maybe complaining yourself. And yet, the total share of people's income they're spending on gasoline may be like 2%. All right, it's not a rounding error, but it's not very much. On the other hand, it's very typical to spend about 10 times that much on housing, about 20% of your income. So when you raise the price of housing, when you double the price of housing, or if you're in the Bay Area, you have easily multiplied it by 5 or 10 times, you aren't just jacking up the price of some minor thing, you are greatly increasing people's cost of living. So rough estimate, if the US did not have this regulation, cost of living overall would be about 10% lower. And if you do the math, that means that with this simple act of deregulation, we've got housing prices, we have the standard of living up by 11%, right? Because divide something by 0.9, that's the same as multiplying it by 1.11. All right. Now, this brings me to the really extreme claim that I make in the book, and I'm happy to do it. So I love extreme claims as long as they're true. Right? Now, you may have heard people claim to have panaceas, and normally you just think that this is a scammer sending you an email to take your money. Right? I have figured out a new drug that cures all problems. Right? It's like, yeah, no, you haven't, and you are lying. All right, but for housing regulation, I really do have a chapter called the Panacea Policy, named after her. Panacea, the Greek goddess of universal remedy. So she's actually a mythological figure, which was nice for me to realize because then she can make a cool character in the book. All right, so what I'm going to say is that not only would deregulating housing give us this big benefit of a higher standard of living, reducing the cost of a very vital item, but actually would make a major dent in a long list of other problems that seem totally unrelated. A long list of social ills that people are complaining about, and we've got one policy that can go and make a big difference for all of them simultaneously with one fell swoop. All right, so what am I talking about? Well, just to start, when you make the price of housing much more expensive in the most desirable areas, there's actually an additional effect, which is that a lot of people don't want to live in those desirable areas anymore. And that's unfortunate because those desirable areas generally have very high productivity per worker. Places like Silicon Valley are actually centers of American innovation, centers of the US economy. If we could move a lot more people there, we could increase production by a lot, but due to those enormous housing costs, people are reluctant to move there. All right. By the way, it really used to be the case in the United States that there was an almost foolproof way for most people to get a raise. And that is move from wherever you are to a high-wage part of the country. So back in 1950, if you're in Mississippi, just move to New York and get the same job you had in Mississippi. Back then you would only pay a little bit more in rent, you'd get a lot more in wages, and you get a big increase in your standard of living. Nowadays, though, if you move from Mississippi to New York, you actually generally will be poorer after that because the extra housing costs will eat up more than 100% of the wage gains. It is true you make a lot more money in New York, but it does not even come close to covering those extra housing costs for most people. And therefore, due to the system where we have raised the price of housing in the most desirable parts of the country, we've also frozen a lot of people out of the opportunity to improve their lives. So this points to a straightforward way to dramatically increase living standards, which is, of course, housing deregulation. What are some other things that we can get out of housing deregulation? Many other social ills that people are complaining about a lot. Hardly anyone connects it to housing regulation because the economists haven't done it in graphic novel format yet. But once this book is out, obviously everyone will be talking about this all the time, and victory will swiftly follow. All right, maybe not, but we'll see. We'll just have to wait for a new generation of children where this was their favorite bedtime book grows up, and then finally. All right, so what are some other problems that housing deregulation would make a big dent in? Inequality. A lot of people complain about large gaps between rich and poor. When economists actually looked at the numbers, they reached an amazing finding. All of the increase in inequality in the US since around 1950 can be explained by the rising cost of housing. If housing costs had stayed at the cost of production, we would not have seen an increase in inequality. Right? If you just think about people that you know that are really rich who live in nice homes, and also think about how many of them might have actually bought at low prices 40 years ago. Yeah, so my parents' home is now worth well over $1 million. They bought it for, I think, $45,000 in Los Angeles. Some of that's inflation, but most of it is actually not inflation. The US price level has not multiplied 20-fold during that time, not even close. Rather, they got lucky and they benefited from the housing regulation that led prices in their area to be able to rise enormously without provoking the historic response of just building a lot more housing. All right. Furthermore, if you think about this a bit more, let's see. So people own their own homes compared to tenants. Which group tends to be richer, homeowners or tenants? Yeah, homeowners, of course. So yeah, this is going to reduce the price of homes. So there is that, right? And then secondly, of course, people who are younger also tend to not have it, and that is another aspect of inequality. All right. Another thing people are complaining about a lot, lack of social mobility. It seems hard to people for someone who starts off poor to end up rich, right? Once again, if we were able to go back to the old system where you can simply move to the high-income areas of the country and do whatever you're doing here for more money, that would be a really simple way of increasing social mobility. Another issue that people have talked about quite a bit, I was a student of Ann Case. She's the co-author with Angus Deaton of a book called Deaths of Despair. This is a book about, well, let's see, Deaths of Despair. In particular, it is about how there's been an enormous increase in deaths from alcohol abuse, drug abuse, and suicide for non-college males. Now, their story is that a lot of non-college males feel like there isn't meaningful work for them in the modern economy. They're not going to become computer programmers. They don't want to go and be a waiter in a restaurant. They feel like there's a lack of traditional manly work. So you could go and say how terrible for you to have these sexist notions, or you could say, well, maybe more of us will kill ourselves, or you could have some actual practical response to this problem. Now, here is my practical response. We deregulate housing, which leads to a large increase in employment in construction. And let's see, is construction a big occupation? Yeah. So this isn't just like getting some extra jobs in making amusement parks. This is already a large occupation. If you could double employment in that occupation, that would be many millions of additional jobs. Also, what are the typical demographics of people working construction? Male or female? Yeah, male. College or non-college? Non-college. So an actual viable solution for this problem of lack of meaningful work for non-college males. Never mind, they could also afford to be buying the homes they're building if prices were a lot lower. Another issue that people have been complaining about a lot is homelessness. Now, I don't want to push this too far. There are some extreme cases where someone will spend whatever money you give them on fentanyl, and it's very hard to help a person like that. However, most people who are homeless are not like that. Most people who are homeless are rather people who are having trouble making rent, people who are not literally living on the streets, but they have irregular housing. And here is what, in my mind, is the most convincing evidence that housing regulation is closely related to this. Think about Mississippi, famous for being the poorest US state. Think about the Bay Area, famous for being super rich. Which of those two areas has an enormous homeless problem? Bay Area. Homelessness in Mississippi is really low. It's like, why? Because almost any job in Mississippi will give you enough money to get a place to live. All right, now again, it's not the only thing going on. I didn't claim this was a panacea in the sense it would be a 100% solution for 100% of all problems. Just a panacea in that it makes a big dent in a long list of problems. Another one, low birth rates. All right, this is one where there's only a few papers on it, but the papers, to my mind, make a lot of sense. I only have 4 kids. If I were in a 1-bedroom apartment, I don't think I would have wanted to have 4 kids. Right? It is very stressful to have a lot of kids in a really small place. Think about this further. How stressful is it to have a bunch of kids if you still live with your parents? Real stressful. Right? And that is really what we have moved towards in high-cost areas of the country, is people just keep living with their parents. Their parents often bought the home when it was much cheaper, so they can let you stay there. But for you to go and replicate your parents' standard of living is very hard. You might have to be 40 or 50 before you could do it, and that is past the time for having kids. All right. So again, if you are worried about low birth rates, I do have a book on this, so I think it is a reasonable worry. Thinking about ways to make it more comfortable for people to start families at a younger age, as well as to have a larger number of kids. It's no mystery why people in New York City, if they have kids, they have like 1 kid, right? Because otherwise you are falling over each other in your tiny New York apartment. But again, in terms of technology, there's no reason why people in New York City couldn't have big apartments. If we just had a lot more skyscrapers, the price of housing would be a lot less per square foot, and then people could have a really nice big apartment instead of having to squeeze into a closet. Crime. This is one where you might say, what does crime and housing regulation have to do with each other? Here, there's actually a really cool experiment in Philadelphia. And if this is an actual experiment. All right, so there's some people noted, wow, Philadelphia has a ton of vacant lots where there's nothing there. All right, and it seems like these vacant lots are standardly centers of crime. Gangs go and hang out in the vacant lots. There is violence in the vacant lots. There's other activities in the vacant lots. All right, and then there was a big study that was done saying, hey, how about we go and we get a list of all the vacant lots in Philadelphia, and then we randomly go and pick half of them for beautification. So we will randomly go and take half the vacant lots, and we will clean up the weeds and the trash, and we'll plant trees and grass and put some picnic benches in there and put a little picket fence, and then see what happens to crime. The result of the study was that the neighborhoods near the vacant lots that had been beautified did see a substantial reduction in crime afterwards. Right? And the authors of the study were like, great, let's go and beautify all the vacant lots. And I was reading this and saying, wait, why are there vacant lots in Philadelphia? Why are there a lot of vacant lots? I think it was up to like 18% of the land area, or at least the residential land, or like residential commercial land area in Philadelphia was just vacant with nothing in it. And if once you know about housing regulation, you realize, those vacant lots are largely a product of regulation. Why does someone who has a valuable piece of property not build anything on it? Probably because they cannot get permission to build anything on it. There are other reasons. Maybe they're waiting for housing deregulation to come, and then they think it'll be great, but probably not. All right, so it is actually realistic to think that allowing deregulation would make a big difference for vacant lots, which would in turn lead to a reduction in crime. Now, political polarization. This is the last one, and I put a question mark behind it. This is the main one that I'll just say, it's speculative. I don't have any really good evidence, but it makes sense to me, so I'll tell you anyway. Say, look, you may have noticed that we have a great political divide in this country. And much of it comes down to mutual animosity. There's a lot of just pure antagonism of people just hating people on the other side. Some of the most interesting evidence in my mind is that back in the 1960s, there were surveys that said, would you object if a close family member married someone of the opposite party? In the 1960s, only 5% of people said they cared. Now it's up to about 30%. So it's like, ugh, I don't want them marrying that thing and having that kind of person in our family. That is terrible. All right. Now, what's nice about housing regulation? Well, I say it is a big policy reform that people of all political views really should be able to converge on and agree with. How so? Well, if you're left-wing, we can just go down the list and say, hey, making housing cheaper for working people, that sounds good. Reducing inequality sounds good. Raising social mobility sounds good. Improving prospects for working class males sounds good. Reducing homelessness sounds good. And let's see, maybe you don't care about low birth rates, but reducing crime, maybe that sounds good too. All right, and on the other hand, you could go over to conservatives and say, deregulating, does that sound good? Allowing there to be a large expansion of the construction sector where working class males who largely vote Republican can now go and get high-paid jobs. How about that? Right? And of course, there are plenty of conservatives who are worried about problems like inequality and social mobility as well. So it does seem like, at least based upon stated philosophy, this is the kind of policy that should actually be able to get broad bipartisan support. That doesn't mean it really will, because there's not a lot of logic in politics, right? There's really a lot of illogic, and there's many people who just support things because the other side opposes them, right? Like, why is being vaccinated a Democratic thing? Operation Warp Speed was something that was started under Trump, and yet vaccines became Democratic and not getting vaccinated became Republican. And I don't have any good story other than Democrats like it, so we don't. And of course, you can see this on plenty of other policies as well. So, but if we could just put that behind us and just say, is there something constructive that we could do that we agree on? Seems like it should be this. All right, so why not? All right, so there we have the dirty word of deregulation. I know a lot of people don't like the word, but I also really believe in truth in advertising and not sugarcoating things. So yeah, I am talking about deregulation. As I explain in the book, you don't need to believe in deregulation on everything. This is a book about housing. This is controversial enough. I don't say anything about banking. I don't say anything about financial markets. That would be a totally different book. All I'm talking about here is deregulating housing so it is much easier to build a lot more stuff. All right, so why is it that we don't have it? Well, pretty simple. If you go and look at public opinion, you will see that people very strongly support housing regulation. Or if you just talk to human beings, talk to almost anyone about it, and you will see that almost everyone thinks that the regulation that we have is a good idea. Right? Why? Well, people think that life will be much worse without it. If you go and talk about building things or allowing people to build things, normally what you get is a long list of angry complaints. Here's just a few. Traffic, there's gonna be terrible traffic. We can't go and build anything new or else there'll be piles of traffic. That's terrible. All right, or parking. It's already impossible to park. You can't build anything new or else there's gonna be nowhere to park. Or the environment. The builders are just going to clear cut everything. It's going to be terrible. They're going to violate Mother Earth. We got to stop this right here, right now, not let them build. Or they're just preserving the character of the neighborhood. Like, this is a single family neighborhood. To build an apartment complex would totally disrupt the kind of neighborhood this is supposed to be. Yes, in New York City, they literally have historic parking garages. A parking garage built 80 years ago. It can't be torn down. This parking garage is part of the very spirit of this neighborhood, can never be changed. And then, of course, there's preventing conflicting uses. Without regulation, what would stop someone from putting a pig farm in Beverly Hills? All right, so these are some of the main ones. There are, of course, a lot of others. Is blocking out my light with your skyscraper. Hey, before I had a lot of light. Now I don't have as much light. So the fault is your skyscraper. All right. Now, I've got some general rebuttals, although the important thing to understand about the rebuttals is that they are not 100% rebuttals. Is it true that sometimes a skyscraper blocks somebody's light? Of course, sometimes it does. Right? But is that really the end of the world? Should all of life and housing policy revolve around these kinds of complaints? And that's what I will say is no. We have paid way too much attention to people who complain and way too little attention to awesome stuff that didn't happen. All right, so just to start with the big ones. All right, so let's see. Is everyone here taking an economics class? All right, so let me start with one of my favorite economic slogans. Gratis is not great. Yes, it's bad to have free stuff usually, not free pizza, but other free stuff is bad. Well, maybe pizza. All right, how so? Well, when you make something that is scarce free, then it becomes inconvenient to access. When you say that everyone can drive for free during rush hour, you get traffic jams. When you say that anyone who wants to can park for free, you get streets full of cars with no parking. Does economics know of any way of mitigating this problem? Yeah, in fact, you usually learn it in the first week. Yes, with prices. Stop giving scarce stuff away for free and charge people for it. Especially now that we have incredible smartphone technology that allows us to vary prices with the level of demand at every single minute of the day. Yes, if you don't want to have traffic jams, raise the price of driving during peak times so that people who don't need to be driving that time can replan their route, or so that people will consider doing carpooling, or that they'll consider public transportation. As long as it's free, you are going to get this horrible clogging of the roads. On the other hand, it is totally clear that no matter how bad the traffic jam is, sufficiently high tolls can get rid of it and get traffic moving. Anyone ever been to Singapore? Saw it with my own eyes. You can drive the speed limit at rush hour in Singapore because they have these kinds of tolls. I know there's a few tolls in this area. When I was at the rental car place yesterday, I looked and okay, I don't need them. Don't need it. Yeah. Although one of them, it seems like it's a lot of mileage.
One of them's E470.
Yeah.
And then there's the one that's like right in front of the car rental return.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the last one's like in Colorado.
All right. Yes. So anyway, this is a very simple problem to solve. What's quite striking, actually, is it usually turns out that people are so disturbed by paying tolls, even very moderate tolls have an enormous reduction in traffic. Right? There's a lot of people like my dad. My dad can't bear to pay for, he's a car collector, but he can't bear to pay for tolls, for parking. Right? Once I told him I was going to Hollywood, and he said, why would you go there? Well, there's some cool stuff there. He's like, well, where are you going to park? In a parking garage? He's like, I raised you better than that, son. We don't pay for parking in this family. All right. So yes, you can go and easily get congestion problems solved by raising the prices of driving, in particular during peak times. And this is a much smaller burden than doubling the cost of housing. Right? You're saying, well, the tolls are bad for the poor. Yes, also having housing cost twice its cost of production is bad for the poor. And that is a much larger impact. Same thing for parking, of course. Right? Now, it is common to at least have meters, but normally the meters grossly underprice parking in desirable areas. And even when we have smartphones that would make it really easy to go and just raise prices during peak times, normally it doesn't work that way. At least in my area, usually, even with the smartphone app, you can only park for 2 hours. How stupid is that? Why can't I park for 2,000 hours if I pay the price? Well, the app will collect it. Why do you go and say I can only have 2 hours? Why not make life convenient for people instead of making it such a pain in the neck? I was just in Nashville where they did not have any kind of smart meters. So it took us like 5 different places to find somewhere where they give us quarters for meters. It's quite annoying. All right. So traffic, parking. Let's see. There's another fun one. See, it'll come to me. All right. Now, I'll come back to that. All right. Now, on the environment, it turns out that the popular view that allowing construction, especially in the most regulated areas, is bad for the environment is totally wrong. The opposite is true. Cities are very green because you basically pack a whole lot of people into a small area where they then have very little effect on the environment. Furthermore, by packing them in, you wind up reducing greenhouse emissions. So cities are actually precisely what you should be deregulating. They also happen to be the most regulated thing. So we have the most room to deregulate in cities. We can get a lot more people living there. And most of the complaints about cities do go away if you actually go and get the price down. You don't have to live in a small congested area if we make housing a lot cheaper. Furthermore, another key result here is that the best areas in the country to allow lots of construction are basically like Southern California, places where the weather is really good, so you don't need to spend a lot on heating and cooling. And then what does California in its enormous ignorant self-righteousness do?
The opposite?
Yes. Well, they have an extremely strict regulations, many of them to protect the environment and the planet, which do what? Well, if you can't live in California, do you just disappear off the face of the earth? You go to another place with worse weather where you will actually have a much larger negative impact on the planet by spending more money on heating and cooling. If California actually wanted to help the earth, they would be deregulating, especially Southern California like crazy because they've got really good weather. Northern California is pretty good too. Coastal California is good too. The desert's not good. right? But anyway, really most of the people who live in those deserts are there because of those high prices in the desirable areas. I had a friend who lived in LA, and basically every year prices, you kept thinking, I'm gonna wait till I get a raise and then I'll buy a house here in LA. And prices kept rising faster than his raises. Then finally he said, all right, I'm just gonna go to Palm Springs, right? Where he was able to get a place on his salary. All right, so yes, you get a lot of environmental gains by allowing a lot of construction in areas with really good weather. And yet we have this unfortunate fact that the areas of the US with the best weather are the ones that are most regulated. And usually explicitly with the self-congratulatory, we're doing this for Mother Earth. And it's like, no, that does not make sense. All right. Furthermore, when people worry about putting pig farms in Beverly Hills, you guys know anything about Houston? So Houston is a city that famously has very little regulation for separation of use. Turns out that when you go there, it doesn't look that different from other places. It looks a little different. It's a little more flexible. But the reason is that there is a natural separation of uses based upon market incentives. Why? Well, suppose that you are an industrial plant. Where do you want to locate? You generally want to locate near docks and train stations, right? Which are ugly, dirty places usually. So when you have regulations saying that industry must be there, it's basically saying that industry has to do something that it probably would have done anyway. Similarly, commercial development. Usually you want to put commercial development near major roads so that you get people who drive by and see it. If there is a ritzy neighborhood, usually what do you want to build in a ritzy neighborhood? Other nice stuff. You don't want to put a pig farm in Beverly Hills because you are paying an enormous premium for desirable land to go and put something that could be anywhere because the pigs don't care where they live. I don't think. No. All right. So that. Let's see, there was one other free one I want to talk about. What is it? It'll come back to me. All right. So really, why not? Why is it that we actually have this regulation? There's a story that almost all economists love, and they keep telling it to me, and I keep saying not totally, at least overstated, and in many ways wrong. And this one just says, look, it totally makes sense we have all this regulation because most Americans own their own home, and they want the price of their home to be high. And if they supported deregulation, this would go and make prices go down. So people vote for their own self-interest. What we call NIMBY, not in my backyard, actually makes perfect sense for most people. And then the tenants are minorities, so they just get ripped off and they suffer, and that's our system. All right. So anyway, this is a story a lot of people like, but it's actually grossly overrated for several reasons. For one thing, if it really did come down to self-interest, we could go and make a deal with homeowners. And there's a lot of pretty obvious deals that we could make. Like, how about if you let us build a bunch of new stuff, the old homeowners don't have to pay any property taxes, and we have high property taxes on the new people. How's that for a deal? If it was just about economic self-interest, at minimum, you'd want to say, can I see the numbers? In practice, however, I've noticed people do not want to see numbers. There's a great book called Neighborhood Defenders. This book actually realized, the authors realized that the state of Massachusetts keeps a database of everyone complaining in different town planning meetings. And what they found is that people come to these meetings full of anger. They're not there to make money. They're there to crush. They're there because they just don't want it to happen. They don't want to negotiate. Right? So, but this is not what a person who wants to make money does. Right? When I was talking to the apartment owners this morning, I said, if there's a customer who comes and says, I want you to do something that's really expensive, will you do it? Do you just say, no way, get out of my office? No, if you're running a business, you say, well, happy to do it if you will pay a premium of $1.1 million. Right? This is what we generally do not see in any discussion of housing regulation. Instead, we see the usual thing in politics where people act like it's a religion. Like this is a sacred principle that we can't tear down the Tivoli smokestack. That smokestack is our heritage. It must never fall just so that someone can get rich. It's not just so someone can get rich, it's also that some rich person can build some housing for people. How about that? All right. In general, the slogan of anyone who wants to make money is not no, but let's make a deal. There's very little in the way of deal making, unfortunately, in this regulation. Like I said, that proposed regulatory change where there's a skip the line pass for regulation, you just charge a developer a pile of money if they want to get going right away, that is not on the table anywhere. Right? So this is not really about a cleverly crafted way to make a lot of money or just to help people or insiders. It is more of a usual case of political dogmatism of just saying, no deal, no way, this is sacred, not open to discussion. Now, some other points. There are many ways in which deregulation is actually good for existing owners. Think about my friend who owns 5 acres of land. Would it be good for him if there was deregulation? Yeah, because he has a pile of land that he doesn't really want. And so he could go and subdivide and build more places there, and he could make a lot of money off of that. Existing regulations do not allow him to do that. Right? If you want to go and knock down your home and put a bigger one there, often that has regulatory problems too. One thing in my area that's very common is that someone that wants to go and knock down an old home and build a new one knocks down everything except for one wall. Do they do this around here? Knock down everything except for one wall? Because if you knock down one wall, then the regulations that you are subject to are for home improvement, not for a total rebuild. So you knock down one wall, knock down everything but one wall, and then you build a big mansion around it. All right, and that the regulators will let you do. But why can't I knock down the last wall? Why are you being so unreasonable about this? All right, so what about owners who want to upgrade? Or here's another one. What about people who would like their adult children to be able to live nearby? Right now, does everyone here feel like you could easily buy a home right next to your parents? Right. Yeah, like either you're going to have to go and live far away from them, or you're going to have to go and stay with them. So either too far or way too close. One of those two options. Right? So if you are a homeowner and you're saying, well, I don't want deregulation that's going to reduce the value of my property. Well, suppose that's right. It will also reduce the price that your kid has to pay. And you want your kid to be here, right? Yeah. Right now, actually, one of the main ways that people keep their kids close is they subsidize your down payment for a home near them. So it's like, well, we support regulation to get my home price up. Then I can go and use that high home price to get a home equity loan. And I take that loan money and I give it to my kids so they can afford to buy a house near me. This is a very convoluted plan. Would be easier if housing prices were just low so that your kids could easily afford to live near you. Another striking fact about public opinion is that when we actually ask people about housing regulation, normally tenants are highly supportive as well. It is not just homeowners who think that we should keep the regulations that we have. Tenants as well. If you talk to tenants about letting apartment builders build a bunch of extra apartments, normal reaction is, again, like those rich fat cats are just going to go and build a bunch of stuff and terrible, right? It's like, well, who do you think they're going to do with it? It's not like they're just going to live in a giant apartment building. They're going to rent it to people, right? Now, since you are on economics, I bet you'll all see the error of this, but there are a lot of people who hear this and say, oh, so this is just so naive. You think that if we just let people build a bunch of housing, they'll feel grateful and then they'll make it cheap. No, that's not the story. The story rather is if you let them build a lot of housing, the only way to fill it will be by cutting prices. Right? If you're running your lemonade stand and no one is buying your lemonade, what do you do to get sales up? Cut the price. Yeah, if you're charging $5 for a cup of lemonade, you're not going to have any customers. Cut it down to 50 cents, you can get some customers. If you build a lot of new apartment units and you try to sell them at the same price as they were before this large increase in building, it's going to be hard to fill. This is basic supply and demand. Now, it is a little bit more complicated because usually people look and say, yeah, but you go and you build like nice new stuff. How does that help poor people? Right? And the answer is just a little bit more subtle. It's like, well, let's see. Who's going to move into the really nice apartment building? It's going to be some rich people. They vacate where they were. They're leaving places that are not quite as nice. Who moves in there? Well, people are living in, say, the grade B- housing. So you build new A+ housing. The people that are living in the A housing move there. Who moves into the previous A housing? The people who are in A-. Who moves into the A-, B+, and so on. All these housing markets are connected. If you take a look at housing that is considered undesirable today, it's not like when it was first built, people said, hey, let's build some really undesirable stuff. Rather, what happens is that people build stuff to make it good at the time, and then over time, it gets older. You can go and put a lot of resources into improving it, but the normal thing is that the worst housing is usually older housing, right? But when you build new housing, this frees up through a giant chain of movement the other housing, and this is how you wind up getting more housing for everyone when you go and allow people to build more stuff. All right, so what's really going on? All right, so my first book is The Myth of the Rational Voter. I'm very open to the idea of politics as a religion. Right, this is not an idea I came up with. When people write the history of the 20th century, a lot of them say, seems like in the 20th century, politics kind of did what religion used to do, gave people an excuse for mass murder, gives people something to believe in and to be angry about, and an excuse to hate some other people who don't believe the same thing, right? And that seems like a pretty good description of the 20th century, and I don't know, maybe even now. Even now, we're not mass murdering each other in America right now, right? But yeah, probably not. All right. But anyway, politics, I think there's a lot to the idea that it is a lot like religion. It's something that people get angry about, they're fanatical about, they don't want to think about it, but they do want to believe it. All right, so what are some other stories about why there is so much support for housing regulation? Now, here I often think about my dad. Like 30 years ago, there was a new development that got approved about half a mile from our house. And he came home and he was so angry, like those corrupt city councilmen in bed with the developers. This is going to be terrible for us. And he was angry for several weeks. And then they built hundreds of new houses. And my dad never complained about it again. And when I reminded him of it, he's like, I don't remember any of that. Why would I have a problem with that? It's like, yeah, well, because it wasn't a problem. Those hundreds of homes didn't do anything to you. It just gave a bunch of other people a chance to live in a nice area. But you wanted to keep them out. You wanted to just keep that as a bunch of vacant lots. There were some baseball fields there that they just went and moved to the local park. All right, so what are some other stories about what is going on? First big one, status quo bias. In psychology, they have noticed that people get very attached to the status quo, and they act like the status quo is sacred and should not be changed, like the Tivoli smokestack. You guys know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah, sorry, I'm not the first person to notice the smokestack. All right, that smokestack, that's part of our heritage as Denverites. What do you call yourselves? Denverites. All right, like that's part of our people. That's the way we are. Like without that smokestack, we wouldn't really be Denver anymore. All right, people have a lot of attitudes like this, and guess what? It turns out that this is mostly illusory. People think they can never adjust to these changes, and after the change happens, they adjust pretty well. Not every time, but most of the time. There is a overreaction when someone suggests that there could be some changes in the status quo, which makes it hard for improvements to happen. This status quo bias is so strong that when Americans have been surveyed about what if we could come up with a drug that would let people have a healthy life forever, most Americans are against it. How can you be against that? That's the best thing ever. I mean, but here's the crazy thing. If someone were to say, what if there was a new medical treatment that would extend human life by a year? Well, that's good. But not forever. Forever is terrible. Because that would fundamentally change things. Like, yeah, well, I can use that kind of fundamental change, right? I mean, you guys, maybe you're not worried about dying yet, but it's starting to get on my mind. All right, so, and you're like, would it change our society a lot if nobody ever died again? Hell yeah, it'd be really different. Like tenure would be even better than it already is. It's already ridiculous. But yeah, like 1,000,000 years of getting paid to do my job. All right. So of course, there'd be enormous change in our society if we could live forever. But for someone to think about that and leap to the conclusion that it would be bad, come on. To get rid of death itself, it would be worth making a lot of other changes in order to do that. All right, so that's status quo bias, and I think this is what is behind a lot of housing regulation, historic parking garages being the most egregious example. All right, another big one, economic illiteracy. All right, now, in the first week of economics, you learn that when you increase supply, holding demand constant, you reduce prices. But there are a lot of people in this world who hear that and just say, that is just like a right-wing dogma. That is just something that you made up, something to justify your horrible existence. It's not. It's fact. Of course, when you increase supply, you are going to reduce prices. Obviously. How could it be otherwise? What is striking to me is that when people deny this, you can often even see that they actually believe it themselves if you just push them a little bit harder. All right, so like for example, when people on the one hand say, look, you just can't say that increasing supply is going to reduce prices. And on the other hand, they'll say we need to keep out cheap foreign imports. Well, what do you think is going to happen if we keep out the cheap foreign imports? It's going to do what for domestic producers? Raise prices. That's this horrible right-wing dogma you were complaining about that's in every economics textbook taught by people of all different political persuasions, but somehow people are convinced that this is some weird and exotic idea. It is not. It is total common sense, right? It works the same way for demand, by the way. On the one hand, I've talked to many people say, oh, it's just total myth that the minimum wage reduces employment. On the other hand, when you get to the part of your job application where it says salary requirements, I don't know anyone who puts $1 million an hour. Why not? Why not put $1 million an hour? Because everybody in their heart of hearts knows that if you put that kind of wage expectation down, it will reduce the odds that you get a job offer, of course. All right, so economic illiteracy is a big part of the deal. A general way of thinking about the world where you say, well, look, why would someone do that out of the goodness of their hearts? So yeah, I'm not saying they would do it out of the goodness of their hearts. I'm saying they would do it in response to competitive pressure. Like, why was it that builders used to eventually cut the price of housing back down to its physical cost of production? Was it because the builders used to be nice and now they're mean? It's because back in the old days, it was legal to keep building more and more stuff until the price fell down to its physical cost of production, so competition impelled you to do so. Another big reason why there's so much support for housing regulation, I say, is just innumeracy. All right, so think about this. You win $1 trillion and then you lose $1 billion. So is that like about even? No. In fact, $1 trillion minus $1 billion approximately, not exactly, but approximately equals $1 trillion. Yeah. And yet, when you listen to people complaining about building new housing, they will give lists where the items on the list are of widely varying magnitudes. Like things like, it'll block my light. All right, well, like how many dollars is that worth? Or like, it'll mess up my view. Okay, well, can we put a dollar value on that? Right, and just go down the list. There are so many petty complaints like, well, it could be very bad for a certain species of bird. Had you ever even heard about the species of bird until you started trying to block this project? Right, and so on. So if you just think about putting positives and negatives in a spreadsheet with numbers attached, that gives you a very different perspective, right? Now, of course, in politics, you can get very far with a horrible story that quantitatively is almost nothing, but if it has enough graphic details, then it can move mountains, right? So say, look, I mean, you can actually get people to be worried about building stuff when nothing has even happened. It's like, look, if we allow these additional homes to be built, that could lead to a substantial increase in traffic, and there are some kids that could play there. This could lead to a child dying. All right, I suppose it could, but what's the probability? Everyone who's here, you left your home, you risked death walking on the streets of Denver. Why did you do it? Is it because you didn't know that people sometimes die walking the streets of Denver? If so, I'm sorry, but well, actually, it's good for you to know, right? Keep it in mind. All right, right. It's like, well, yes, there's a chance, but it's a small chance. And I thought I'd rather go and get the extra credit for coming to this lecture and take a tiny chance of dying. Right? Which is the reasonable way of thinking about it. This is what economists have been trying to get people to think about all the time. Anytime someone says, if it saves one life in a country, like thousands of people die every day. Like, can we go and base our entire civilization upon we can't do anything if any possible thing could go wrong? Well, that would be the end of civilization as we know it. As we saw during COVID, that kind of was the end of civilization as we knew it for a while, right? But in any case, so innumeracy, just refusing to go and assign dollar values to complaints and instead basing it upon the sheer graphicness of it. Of course, this is probably the worst example of this is the trillions of dollars we spent fighting terrorism. It's like, well, murder is less than 1% of all death. Terrorism is less than 1% of all murder. So why are we spending trillions of dollars fighting it? Because the stories are terrifying. It's like, well, what if we studied out regular murders in great detail? Well, the stories aren't as good. Right? People can be more worried about totally fictional terrorism. Like there are Anyone see the show 24? It's now kind of old, dated, but yes. Basically, every season, the world almost ends. Right? And people watch this show, it's like, oh my God, this is a really serious show. It's like, no, it's not. It's not a serious show. It's total fantasy. If it were really true that the world was always teetering on the edge of extinction, after 8 seasons, it would have happened. But somehow, one American hero, Jack Bauer, keeps saving the world. That's not how the real world works. If we're teetering on the edge, eventually somebody screws up and we fall. All right. And then the last one, closely related, just sheer paranoia. Like when I was reading this book, Neighborhood Defenders, just the lurid scenarios that people will paint about what would happen if you allowed someone to go and build 2 extra apartments. People would just make up ridiculous stories. Like, well, once we have these apartments in, this could bring in the wrong kind of person. There could be chain gangs here. There could be murderers. Like, we don't know what's going to happen. We just need to stop this before it starts. It's like, what are the odds? If someone was asking you to go and put a bet on this, what betting odds would you actually assign to this extreme, improbable, hysterical scenario? Super low. And yet, unfortunately, we have a system where we have based policy upon this hysteria, leading to a world where housing costs twice what it needs to. All right. Closing thoughts. Yeah, here I can actually expand it. That's cool. All right, so there's a part in the book where I talk to Aristotle and Plato. And yeah, have you ever seen, there's the famous painting of Aristotle is pointing to the ground and Plato is pointing to the sky? All right, so anyway, there's an old adage and it says, if you were in a hole, stop digging. And then yes, but why stop there? I say, if you're in a hole, start building. And that is the hole that we're in. All right, so thank you very much.
Okay, we will now take questions from the audience, and just raise your hand. I'll bring you the microphone.
Right, let's see. Is it okay for the filming if I sit down now? Okay, so here, let me get this chair. Okay. All right.
Well, thank you so much.
My
really
pleasure.
eye-opening. I'm just curious if we like just deregulated everything tomorrow, right?
Mm-hmm.
Wave a magic wand. How much do you think the prices would go down? And do you think that would actually be enough, since they're so inflated right now, to support a lot of these positive changes?
Yeah, so like it's not going to change in one day.
Yeah.
But we have an idea about how much building can you get if you're allowed to build whatever you want, and it basically looks like the fastest growing areas of Texas. And so the key thing is that not all areas of the country have the same housing regulation. A lot of this is state and local. So we can actually take a look at the parts of the country that are more pro-development and see what happens. What we see is they just build a lot more stuff, and their prices, in a way, they just don't go up in the first place. But if they do go up, then they come back down more quickly. Yeah, so I would say that even 5 years of a really radical policy like this, I think you really would probably see prices going down 25% at least into that short of a time. This is also one where if people see the writing on the walls and realize, wow, like there's going to be a lot of additional housing that is coming online in the field right now, that is something that tends to make prices fall immediately. So that's this additional secondary effect. So yes, this is the kind of thing where it is just the physical resources are totally there. So probably one issue would just be that if we really deregulated that quickly, it would take a bit of time to train the new workforce. So all of those non-college males that are going to be doing construction, it wouldn't only be them, but probably they're going to be overrepresented heavily. I think that's true in every country I've ever heard of. So it might take 20 years to get things back to the cost of production, but again, that's about the time you guys will be wanting to upgrade to a bigger home, right? So it'll be there.
Oh, I've got the mic. Sorry. I forgot it was in my left hand. Would you actually seriously present this as a panel at Fan Expo? They're actually taking requests right now.
As a panel at what?
At Fan Expo. It's been rebranded. It's rebranded Comic-Con for Denver. It's a nonprofit.
If they asked me, I would definitely go. So we did try getting invited for our other book. And the artist was super famous, but somehow that wasn't quite enough to get on a panel there, which is unfortunate. But yeah, it's total dream for me to get to present at Comic-Con.
I'm just saying this one's a lot more likely because it's a nonprofit Comic-Con, so they're always looking for local talent specifically.
Right. So neither me. Wait. Oh, you mean like Denver Comic-Con? Oh, okay. I thought you meant San Diego Comic-Con.
They rebranded it because
Mhm.
they didn't want it to be affiliated with a profit thing.
So regular Comic-Con is for profit.
Yes. This
Ah.
one specifically is not.
Okay. All right. So, yeah. So in principle, I'm totally open. Are you involved with Denver
I
Comic-Con?
have a friend who
Okay. All right.
used to know some of the old managers, but they've moved on since.
All right. So yeah, like Denver Comic-Con, I'm totally interested, and regular Comic-Con with movie stars, super interested. Yeah. Superhero movies, yeah, that'd be cool. Yep.
So my question is, you talked about economic illiteracy.
Mhm.
So my question is, just with economic literacy and even financial literacy, do you think it not being taught, say from the elementary schools, is done on purpose, since many of these things are eye-opening to anyone that sees it? It begs the question, is it done on purpose, or why isn't it taught earlier so that that we don't have issues with regulation or deregulation? Everyone kind of gets it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have this other book, The Case Against Education, where I look at why is it that American adults know so little? It's not because they're not taught stuff. It just seems to go in one ear and out the other. There's a general rule in psychology, which is if you don't keep using your knowledge, you forget it. They have a fancy word for this. They call it decay, but it's just what everybody else knows about. There are some exceptions, like riding a bike, but for most of the kinds of things that school teaches, unless you keep using it, you will forget most of it. In terms of what would it take for them to not forget it? Probably if we went and taught them every single year from kindergarten on and really pounded into their heads and repeated. Because one of the best ways to get around this problem, people forgetting stuff, is repetition. One of the best ways to get around this problem, people forgetting stuff, is repetition. One of the best ways of getting around this problem, people forgetting stuff, is repetition. So there is that. Another problem, of course, is schools will just say, well, we only have so many minutes in the day, so what is it that we should be teaching? And yeah, I would say, well, let's cut back a bunch of other stuff that people don't remember anyway, like foreign languages, and teach them supply and demand 100 times until they get it, right? So yeah, I think that's, now I will still admit, I don't have proof that even that would work, but it's worth a try. It's totally worth a try.
Hello.
Hi.
Just wondering if you've done this presentation in front of a group opposing housing development or a group of people against housing development, and what reaction was?
You'd be surprised how rarely one gets invited to give a talk to a group that disagrees with what you have to say. No, I have not. I've never been, I'm trying to think. There was one time I was invited to speak to an audience that bitterly disagreed with what I had to say. So I have my book, Open Borders. I was invited to speak to the Writers' Workshop, which, though it doesn't sound like it, is the great umbrella organization of every anti-immigration group in America. Basically, it combines the nationalists against immigration with environmentalists against immigration, with labor unions against immigration, with victims' rights groups against immigration, with labor, so on. And I was brought in there just to have a dissenting voice. But I think that's the only time in my entire life that I've ever been brought in before a hostile audience. I have given lots of talks to just neutral audiences. So audiences that don't have any particular reason to like or dislike me. But it's really hard to talk to people that just don't like you and they don't invite you. You could invite yourself. Probably they're not going to give you the floor. If you know such a group, it would be a learning experience, definitely, if they would have me. I'm kind of thinking they wouldn't, but yes. Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, I had a question kind of going back to when you were talking about it being the grand solution and affecting the multiple social factors. And I was wondering, historically we have gotten back to the level where, historically we've seen the levels where our housing is same as the production costs.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm wondering with it being I imagine more inelastic due to the fact that, people willing to pay more for a roof over their head, and kind of also the modern market dynamics we have now from securitization and just speculation in the housing market. Would we ever reach that we can bring the prices down, but would we ever reach that fully affordable or cost level pricing?
Yeah, so big difference between fully affordable and cost. Mm-hmm. All right, so something can be sold at cost and still be really expensive. right? Like mansions are never going to be affordable, probably, right? Or especially like the Vail mansions, right? I was just in Vail, so it seemed okay. It seemed pretty good. But $25 for a personal pizza seemed excessive. But anyway, is it realistic to think that you could actually get back to cost of production at all? I think it is very realistic. I mean, like if like there's just the ferocious logic of we can make profit by building more, and then this is the first thing. Right? So wait, can we make a profit by building more houses? Yes, and then you build some. All right. Can we still make a profit by building more houses? Yes. Let's build some more. Can we still make a profit by building more? Let's keep building. Let's keep building. This is the way things work in almost every other industry. It really doesn't matter very much whether demand is inelastic or not. I mean, like a classic example of a product with highly inelastic demand is actually salt. Has anyone here ever thought about how much salt costs when you're deciding how much salt to put on some food? Anyone ever said, oh no, I better hold back there. Salt's getting pretty expensive. Salt is a classic example of a highly inelastically demanded good, and yet it's real cheap, right? It's real cheap because if you could make piles of money, like salt were selling for twice its cost of production, people would say, oh, just make some more salt. How hard can it be? Get the salt mine going, boil some seawater. There's all kinds of ways of getting salt. So yeah, now the main areas where you might think that the prices would stay high would be if you actually have the true geological constraint. Like for example, like if you want to have coastal property and the coastal property is on sandy soil where you just can't build a skyscraper because it would collapse. All right, so that's the kind of thing where you wouldn't expect the deregulation would bring housing prices down. So there's certain kinds of rare geographies, right? Or I guess geologies or I guess it's more like geology, right? Where you just can't go and use all of these incredible techniques, but most of it you just can. Right? And like the skyscraper technology, to realize that's 100 years old and we use it a lot less than they did originally. It's kind of shocking. It's like building a new skyscraper 100 years ago, it's like, yeah, totally. And now it's like, I don't know about that. What could go wrong? We have 100 years of experience with what goes wrong. I think we know what we're doing at this point.
Hi,
yes, please.
My name is Jen, and I study urban planning and urban design at CU.
All right.
So you did mention that obviously to implement all of this, it's going to take like 20 years to expand the market. But
to get it fully done. Yeah.
Well, yeah. So a lot of the planning endeavors in urban design efforts are focused in on missing middle housing.
Mm-hmm.
So you did mention the whole one wall regulation
Yeah.
and all of those things. What are your thoughts on like missing middle housing one, and then like suburban like retrofitting, and then like retrofitting single family homes?
Yeah, so I was just talking to people who produce the missing middle housing. So Colorado Apartment Owners Association. These are all people who rent apartments. A lot of them build apartments, right? And this is one of the most regulated parts. And this is an area where if you want to go and build just regular apartments, not luxury apartments, but also not apartments for people who are very poor, then you have to go through a pile of regulatory hurdles. So you've got to go through all the problems with getting, first of all, hardly any land is available for multifamily. And then there is an additional set of regulatory approval. All the neighbors get to complain about it. It's like, oh my God, we might have to live next to apartment people. We all know how horrible apartment people are. That's terrible, right? So this is what they do for a living, is try to go and build this stuff. And this is one of the very most regulated, skyscrapers even more so. But just a regular old 6-story apartment building is one of the most regulated parts, especially if you want to put it in a downtown area. So yeah, this is one of this is one of the quickest things that would happen, because once you were actually allowed to build it, probably actually it would be so much more valuable to put apartments up than what they're currently building. Right now, I think you might actually see them just going and knocking over some half-done single-family homes. So wait a second, we could put apartments there instead. Just erase, and put in the apartments, because you just make a lot more money by putting a whole bunch of people into that area than you do right now. The idea that what builders want to do is to build a very small number of luxury homes. It goes against the obvious fact that builders almost always put in the maximum number of homes that the zoners let them put in. They almost always go right to the limit of what's legal. It looks like they want to do more. Right? Because normally, actually almost all the regulations are about minimum lot size. There's almost nothing about maximum lot size. If a builder wants to put one home on 20,000 acres, you're not going to be stopped. But if you want to go and put 20,000 homes on those acres, then what will this do to the character of the neighborhood? Let's see, other questions? Yeah, please.
First off, my name's Andrew, and I
Hi,
just
Andrew.
wanted to use some examples of like today's issues that I've seen because I study international business. And so first off, my question would be off of like China's issue right now. Their deregulation basically over the course of like the past 4 years has caused like a huge influx, and they also have a demand for a lot of like, how do you say it, apartment buildings as well. But as of like right now, they have over 430 different like, what is it, places, projects, there's the word I was looking for, projects that are all stopped due to they just don't have enough people to go ahead and take over those. And plus they have a, how do you say, such a high demand that people are paying over 40 to 50 times their annual salary for a housing over there. So how would you basically, what would be your solution to what their problem came up to be, especially it being a $13 trillion issue?
Right. So I'd say the main thing that I know about the modern Chinese economy is that it is still officially a communist country. That doesn't mean that they are like they were 50 years ago. But I would say that it's almost impossible to believe that it is just the Wild West and anyone can build anything that they want. I think actually, in order to get anything done in China, normally you need to go and get in good with the local Communist Party that says that it's okay for you to build stuff, and then you go and make a deal with them. And part of the deal is probably we're not going to let some other people building stuff here. So I don't know a lot about what's going on in China. I mean, the general point of they've got hundreds of millions of people that want to move to cities from the countryside, and you need to build a lot of stuff for them. Now, but I thought you were going to talk about vacant properties in China. So you mean,
as in the part of the vacant properties, like 430 of those. So basically how China does their like whole processing of like an individual paying for a house would be necessarily, like I said, first off, it's 40 to 50 times annual salary because it's so inflated there. And then second off, they're paying for housing that's not up. Okay, so that's how high the demand is right now. So they're basically paying for the building of a process. However, they're not getting the house until 10 to 15 years from now.
how does that fit with having a lot of vacant properties?
So this is the issue, though, is that they built so much at one singular time is that their economy wasn't able to basically keep up with their demand that they perceive to have, is what my belief is to be. And that's why certain building companies had to take out more loans out of the government to go ahead and finish these projects in the first place because they were too big. However, you were stating that we have the technology and the purpose to make these big properties, but they showed an example that in the long run, it didn't help them and lost them more money in general.
I guess I would say they're not in the long run yet. I mean, there is something puzzling about having a 15-year wait to go and get a home in a place where there's a lot of vacant ones. Of course, China's a big country, so it could be that the vacancies are in one part of the country and people paying 50 times their salary, or it could be in a totally different part of the country. But I just don't know enough about it. Yeah.
Are there any other, did I miss anyone? You have any questions?
You don't have to walk all the way over here for it, I think. Just that.
Well,
We have time.
we, yeah, we have live stream going on, so. Yeah, go ahead.
All right. I just have a question about if you know whether most of these housing policies are a result of like common law or just legislation.
Yeah, no, it's almost all legislation. Common law, actually, this kind of stuff was illegal.
Gotcha.
Right, so basically, there's a famous Supreme Court case in the 1920s where they said that it's possible to go and regulate not just for physical nuisances like smoke, but also just having the wrong kind of person in the neighborhood. So this was the one. So again, there's a long-standing common law principle that someone can sue you if you make a lot of smoke, or if you go and have horrible, smelly animals or something like that. But then around 1920, there were some localities started passing laws saying you can't build apartments because apartments bring the wrong kind of person into a neighborhood. And then the owner sued and said, well, wait a second, this is totally unlike the previous kinds of nuisance suits that were around before. And the Supreme Court, in a fairly close decision, I think it might have even been 5-4, said, no, this is fine, you can do it. And then this did open up the gates, although it took a long time for things to get bad. To be fair, you didn't immediately see housing prices skyrocketing as soon as this was around. It just took a long time. And a lot of it seems to be just community activism. There's a lot of laws that on the books where if nobody pays attention, it doesn't really matter that they're there. But if there's some angry people who really want to make a stink about it, then they can go and hold up your development for 10 years. So that's a lot of it. But yeah, so basically legislation combined really with activism seems to be the main problem.
Thank you, I appreciate it. I was concerned if it was after reading a book by Richard Posner last semester about common law being economically efficient or whatever.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, this stuff historically basically didn't exist.
yeah, I appreciate it.
Okay, any other questions?
I was wondering, how do you feel about special tax districts popping up where we historically would have had voluntary HOA situations?
Yeah. I mean, again, voluntary HOAs, I think, are a better approach. But going back to what I was saying about let's make a deal, a lot of times a special tax district basically is one of the few ways you can make a deal where they say, okay, well, if we'll go and let you guys build, but in exchange, there's going to be higher taxes, or sometimes it's lower taxes in order to get it going. But basically, like, for example, hotel taxes. This is one where there's extra taxes on hotels, and that money gets earmarked for going and improving things in the area, but also makes it easier to, leaves the local government more willing to go and let you build more hotels because they know they're getting extra taxes out of it. It's not a great system, but it may be the least bad thing that we've got. It may be a path forward, right? And by the way, just to be clear, so I know I've come off as very extreme in this talk, and that's because I just like to tell people what I actually think. But I would never tell someone either agree with me 100% or we have nothing in common, right? If I've changed your mind about one thing, that's one more than I usually succeed in changing people's mind about. My dad, I can't think if I've changed his mind on anything, and he's my dad, right? So he's like, why should I trust you, Brian? Like, I'm your son. Like, doesn't that count for anything? No, doesn't count for anything. So, if we could just go and dial this down, so we can talk about getting rid of all regulation overnight. Yeah, I know that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen, even if we do get my book to sell millions of copies. There's a lot of books that sell millions of copies, and yet still the program in the book does not immediately happen. But if we could just go and dial this down a little bit, one of the main things that economists have done in research is they say, look, imagine if we just turned down the level of zoning tax in the Bay Area down to the normal level for America. How much would that do? And even that, they wind up getting very large numbers for the gain. So just going and taking the most egregiously overregulated places in the country and getting them to come back to sanity, that by itself would have a lot of value.
All right, we have time for one more question. If you have a question, make yourself known. Okay.
All right. By the way, it's great to talk to an audience without masks because I can see your faces and then I know whether what I'm saying sounds ridiculous or confusing or whatever. It was really hard talking to audiences during COVID and just trying to judge from the eyes what people were feeling. Yes.
Yeah, so I guess my quick question is just like, I imagine these regulations, like when you're looking for sourcing, like, you have like that administrative, like federal branch that's coming up, but a lot of it, as you mentioned, like comes from like, municipal, local governments. And, when you come to scenarios where like the power is really concentrated, like council districts, like how do you see that change happening, like within like such small, like isolated environments?
Right, that is a great question. So the US has a very strange system, as you probably have already noticed. But in our system, the state governments have a lot of constitutional authority relative to the federal government. There are a lot of things the federal government cannot make state governments do, or if they at least try, there's a whole court case and it gets to the Supreme Court and then you find out. On the other hand, there is very clear-cut judicial rulings saying that local governments basically have no rights against their state governments. Right, so if a state government wants to go and impose deregulation on the entire state, local governments are not allowed to go and sue them. They are not allowed to go and fight it out in court. They just really have no recourse other than to go and try to win control back of the state government. So this is a lot of what has been happening in places that have been deregulating, is like California and Oregon have passed laws at the state level saying that you can't have single-family zoning anymore. All right, so let's see. Actually, so yeah, no, I think both of them have done it. Now. State government, local governments can still resist a bit, but this is one where essentially the deck is stacked heavily in favor of the state governments. So basically, if you can just win over the state government, then you have almost got to victory. I mean, the main issue is just that sometimes the state governments deliberately undercut the very thing that they were trying to do. So in the state of California, they have gotten rid of single-family zoning, and now you are entitled to go and split a single-family home into up to 4 houses. All right. So that sounds like a big improvement and a big level of deregulation. But if you look at the fine print, there's one bizarre exception or loophole which undoes most of the deregulation. And this says that the owner must occupy his home while it is converted into a larger number of homes. All right, well, has anyone here ever been in a home while work was being done on the home? Yeah, it's a pain in the neck, right? So obviously what a lot of homeowners like to do would be to sell out to a developer at a high price, walk away, and then let the developer just go and do their thing. But the California law says, no, you're not allowed to do that. You have to occupy it. The official rationale is otherwise developers will take all the profits, which would be like saying that if I found a diamond, I would have to cut it myself because otherwise the jewelers would rip me off. It's like, no, if I have a really good diamond, the jewelers will not rip me off. The jewelers will bid against each other and I will get a bit high price. And on the other end, if you tell me I have to cut the diamond myself, what good is it? Because I don't know what I'm doing. Right, so that's really what happened there. But yeah, if you can get state governments on board with this, you can get a lot of progress very quickly. The federal regulation is also important to some degree, and if you could change that, that would make some difference. But yeah, state, I would say the state is sort of the choke point because it is too hard to get every local government to do it, and local governments really do seem to be so heavily influenced by community activists that it's hard to get any progress there. State governments, probably the best bet that we've got. Or actually, my very favorite bet is just for the Supreme Court to overrule what they said in the 20s. And I don't know, maybe the current Supreme Court would do it. Who knows, right? Probably not. But that is the point where in principle, you could just wipe the slate clean. I think that's why it's not going to happen is because look, we don't want people to hate us more. So probably not. All right, thank you guys. This has been fantastic. It's great to be back in Denver. Right, and next time I'm here, I'm hoping that there will be a pile of skyscrapers and you'll all be living in cheap luxury.